Welcome to Lesson 8 of English 10-1, and this is day 1 for that particular week. So we're still looking at poetry, and poetry can be called a dance of words. And in this lesson, we're going to look specifically at the ode and the ballad and the sonnet. So day 1, we're looking at the ode, and we also want to look at some poetic devices and examples of them. So for the first poetic device, symbolism, we want to talk about, and that's when an author uses an object to express a thought or an idea. So one of the strongest tools it can be for bridging the gap between what's in the author of the poem's head and conveying meaning to our own heads is to use a symbol. So it has meaning itself, but it also represents something beyond itself. So the difference between a symbol and a metaphor is a metaphor does not have meaning on a literal level, but a symbol does. So a metaphor says one thing and means something else, whereas a symbol says one thing, means it, but it also means more beside. So a symbol may have several different meanings. So for example, the psalmist uses a symbol of a dove, and the bird can fly literally, but the psalmist uses it to express a desire to escape from his present trouble. So listen to Psalm 55, 5-7. Fearlessness and trembling are come upon me, and horror hath overwhelmed me. And I said, Oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest. Lo, then would I wander far off and remain in the wilderness. So the Bible's full of symbols, and numbers and colors specifically are used as symbols in the Bible and therefore in all literature. So the Bible is very much used in literature, especially the literature of the 16 to the 1900s, and that's because the Bible was probably the most familiar piece of literature to most people, and more people had been exposed to the Bible than any other piece of literature. So it was a common factor that could be used. So as far as numbers, 1 signifies unity, and it could be the unity of God or of the church. Number 2, duality. It can symbolize the divine and the human nature of Christ, as well as his divine nature, or the material or the spiritual world. Number 3 is representative of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. 4 can represent the 4 evangelists or the authors of the Gospels, the 4 corners of the earth, 4 seasons. And 5 symbolizes the 5 wounds that Christ suffered on the cross to his hands, feet, and side. And by extension, it resembles or represents sacrifice. 6 represents creation because God created in 6 days, or imperfection because it falls short of the perfect number 7. 7 is the number of perfection or completion. God rested on the 7th day. Paul lists 7 gifts of the Spirit. Jesus spoke 7 utterances from the cross. So the number 7 is also prominent in the apocalyptic book of Revelation, in which there are 7 seals, 7 churches, and many other things numbering 7. 8 represents regeneration or resurrection. Many baptismal fonts are 8-sided, as well as the baptismal cross. 9 is the number of mystery or angels, since there are 9 choirs of angels. 10 symbolizes completion, or the 10 commandments, 10 plagues. 12 is often used to signify the whole church, since there were 12 disciples, 12 tribes of Israel. 13 represents betrayal, since there were 13 people at the Last Supper. 40 represents trial or testing, since Noah's flood, Israel's wandering in the desert, Noah's stay on Mount Sinai, and Jesus' temptation in the wilderness all lasted 40 days. Season of Lent is also 40 days, and that's likely in respect of those trials or testings that are referred to in the Bible. 100 usually denotes completeness or plenitude, since it is 10 times 10. And 1,000 represents a very large number, infinity or eternity. Now, on to allusion. Allusion is a figure of speech that makes brief, often casual reference to a historical or literary event or object. Biblical allusions are frequent in English literature, and we've already referred to that, such as Shakespeare's "A Daniel come to judgment" in The Merchant of Venice. Strictly speaking, allusion is always indirect. It attempts to tap the knowledge and memory of the reader, and by doing so, secure a resonant emotional effect from the association that already exists in the reader's mind. So it kind of, an use of allusion in literature is done with the expectation that you are well read, perhaps. And sometimes in modern writing, there might be a side note or something so that you have some idea what is being alluded to. Okay? And you need to understand the allusions to understand the work. So it is important to do that. So when you look for allusion in literature, look for a reference to a specific person, event, or object from history or literature. It's sometimes explicit and it's sometimes indirect. And you will have to identify explicit examples of allusion. And if a word or reference to someone or something comes up in literature that you are unfamiliar with, you should research it to see what its significance is. And oftentimes there is some clue or note, a side note or an end note that indicates why it's important. Apostrophe is next, and that is when the author addresses an inanimate object as if it were alive, or when the author addresses an absent person if he or she were present. For example, the psalmist addresses the sea and the mountains and the earth in Psalm 114, 5-7. What ailed thee, O thou sea, that you fled? Thou Jordan, that you were driven back? You mountains, that you skipped like rams, and ye hills like lambs? Tremble, thou earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of God, of the God of Jacob. Hyperbole is an extravagant exaggeration, and it is consciously done and used without trying to make you think it's actually true. And it can heighten effect or provide for comedy as well. Here's some example. If I don't get those jeans, I will die. Maybe you've said that when you're shopping with your parents. I have a million things to do today. No, who hasn't heard someone say that? Probably your parent, right? Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard around the world. Well, we know it wasn't heard all the way around the world. Okay, so you've already learned about some other poetic tools like simile and personification and metaphor, and we talked about hyperbole, symbolism, and allusion already here today, and we talked about apostrophe too. So the language of poetry is almost picturesque, almost always picturesque. It means that the poet is trying to create pictures in your minds to be able to see things in a fresh and new way or feel them differently through our other physical senses such as hearing or sense of touch. Poetry is most often visual though, in the sense that it helps in our minds form a visual impression. We see a body at a funeral, a child chasing geese in the garden, or two people sitting together on the bank of a stream, so that our response begins from a vivid impression of exactly what is happening. Being visual does not just mean describing, telling us facts like color and shape and specific details. Often the vividness of the picture depends upon comparisons. So what we are trying to imagine is pictured in terms of something else that is already familiar to us. And then we are asked to think of one thing as if it were something else. And those are figures of speech, and we also call them figurative language or poetic devices. Something is pictured or imagined or explained in terms of something already familiar to us. Things we can't see or which we aren't familiar to us are pictured as things we can. For example, God is said to be like a father. Italy is shaped like a boot. So that's a way that figurative language can be used. Most poetry depends, at least in part, on the pictorial quality of words and upon the notion that something becomes clearer when we compare it with something else that's more familiar to us. So by using these poetry tools, you'll be able to convey your thoughts and ideas in ways stronger and more vividly than you ever thought possible. And what you're really doing is painting 1,000 words for your reader. All right, lastly today we want to talk about the ode, and the ode is the most elevated and dignified kind of lyric poetry. It was originally a ceremonious poem written to celebrate public occasions or exalted subjects. The earliest odes were probably choric songs incorporated in classical Greek drama. And a couple of the classic authors of odes are Pindar and Horace, and they likely were of the greatest influence to later writers. Pindar's odes were written for musical accompaniment and have an extremely elaborate structure. Those of Horace, although he called them carmina or songs, were not sung, but still had graceful musical meters based on Greek models in 2- and 4-line stanzas. Horace's odes, unlike Pindar's, are often more intimate and meditative. In England, some of the better known poets who wrote odes are Ben Jonson, John Milton, and John Dryden. And there are 2 types of odes in England, the Pindaric ode, which was elaborate and ecstatic, and the Horatian ode, which was more reflective in manner. Odes were very popular during the 19th century, so the 1800s, and famous poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats wrote important odes. During the 20th and 21st centuries, the form has declined in popularity. And here's a portion of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind below. Notice